Look at your locks. Check your windows. Most people live in a state of terminal delusion, thinking their four walls are a fortress against the predatory nature of the world. They are wrong. Home isn't a sanctuary. It's a cage with a roof. Identity is a luxury for those still breathing. But once the cold sets in, your name is just a whisper in the wind. Welcome to X-Crime Noir. I'm not here to tell you a bedtime story. I'm here to dissect a simulation of pure, unadulterated territorial invasion. Germany, 1922. A place called Hinterkaifeck. A farm so isolated and wretched that even the map makers wanted to forget it existed. This isn't just a murder case. It's the story of a family who invited a monster to dinner without even knowing he was sitting at the head of the table. The simulation starts with a breath in the dark. Meet Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, a man carved out of the same frozen mud he farmed. He was cold, he was arrogant, and he was deeply hated by everyone in the village. March 31st. The winter was aggressive, biting into the skin like a starving wolf. Andreas found something that should have made his blood turn to ice. Footprints. A single set of tracks leading from the edge of the obsidian woods, straight across the virgin snow, and directly into the barn. He stood there for hours, watching, waiting for those tracks to turn around and lead back to the safety of the trees. But the snow remained clean. The visitor entered the frame, but never exited. My perspective? Andreas wasn't looking at a burglar. He was looking at his own history, finally growing legs and coming home to settle the score. He didn't call the police. He didn't grab a gun. He thought he was the apex predator. He didn't realize he was already the prey. Then the farmhouse began to breathe with a ghost. Imagine the paranoia. You're eating dinner, and you hear a rhythmic thudding from the attic. Not a rat, not the wind, but the heavy, deliberate weight of a human being moving above your head. Dust falls from the rafters like gray ash. Onto your soup. An unfamiliar newspaper appeared on the porch, a Munich daily, that no one in this backwater village had ever purchased. The keys vanished. Every door in the house became an open invitation. Most people would have burned the farm down and run, but the Grubers were built on pride and dark secrets. They stayed. They lived for days with a parasite watching them sleep, watching them pray, watching them commit their quiet sins. The killer wasn't just hiding. He was observing. He was learning the frequency of their fear. He was domesticating them before he slaughtered them. March 31st, the night the world stopped for the Grubers. One by one, they were lured into the barn. No screams reached the neighboring farms. The wind swallowed the sound of the pickaxe, splitting through bone and muscle. Andreas, his wife, his daughter, his grandchildren, even the maid who had just arrived that day. But here's the most disturbing detail. The killer didn't leave. For 3 days after the slaughter, smoke rose from the chimney. The cattle were fed. The meals were cooked. The killer lived in their house, slept in their beds, and stared at their corpses like a man who had finally found home. The massacre was over, but the occupation had just begun. This is the anatomy of Hinterkaifeck. Let's look at the blood. Focus on the floorboards. Look through the cracks. Imagine being the air in that attic. Cold, stagnant, and heavy with the scent of old hay and human sweat. While the Grubers were praying, someone was watching. Someone was lying flat on their stomach, peering through the gaps, mapping the geography of their lives. He knew when Andreas coughed. He knew when Victoria whispered her dark secrets. He knew the exact moment the candles were blown out. This wasn't a stranger passing by. It was a roommate they never invited. A parasite that had burrowed into the skull of the house. He heard their dreams, before he became their nightmare. The attic wasn't a storage space. It was an observation deck for a predator. Then there was Maria, the replacement. The previous maid had fled 6 months ago, claiming the house was haunted. She heard the footsteps. She felt the eyes. They called her crazy. They called her hysterical. But in my world, the crazy ones are usually the only ones paying attention. Maria arrived on March 31st, a sacrificial lamb delivered straight to the slaughterhouse. She had been in the house for only a few hours, before the iron met her skull. Imagine her fear, unpacking her bags in a room that felt like a tomb. She didn't know that the ghost the others ignored was actually a man of flesh and blood, with a pickaxe and a plan. She was the final piece of the puzzle, the last pulse before the silence. Glitches in the matrix. Small errors in reality. A newspaper from Munich appeared on the farm. Andreas didn't buy it. No one in the village subscribed to it. It was a trophy. A calling card left by the watcher. Then the house keys vanished. Think about that. Every barrier between the family and the predator was gone. Every lock was a lie. Andreas found scratches on the barn door, as if someone had tried to break in, or was testing the ease of getting out. My perspective? This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a long-term habitation. The killer was living in their attic, eating their food, and probably watching them sleep for months. He was a domestic predator. He didn't want their money. He wanted their existence. The climax of the watching, the moment the predator decides the observation is over, and the harvest begins. Night of March 31st. The wind is screaming across the Bavarian plains. One by one, the members of the household are called. Not by name, but by a lure we can only imagine. Maybe it was a noise in the barn. Maybe it was the restless cattle. Andreas goes first. He walks into the darkness, thinking he's the master of the farm. He doesn't see the shadow waiting in the straw. He doesn't hear the breath of the man who has lived above his head for days. The pickaxe is heavy. The strike is clinical. The master is gone. And the parasite is just getting started. Welcome to the barn of blood. Welcome to the production line of death. 10 p.m. March 31st. The air in the barn is thick with the scent of dried hay, animal musk, and a cold, metallic premonition. Andreas Gruber was the first to answer the call of the void. He thought he heard a noise. A restless cow? A broken gate? He walked into the darkness with the arrogance of a master, unaware that the attic parasite had already claimed the territory. No words were exchanged. No time for begging. The pickaxe didn't just hit him. It reclaimed him. A single, vertical strike to the skull. Clean, clinical, efficient. The master of Hinterkaifeck fell into the straw, and the killer didn't even break a sweat. He just reset the trap and waited for the next pulse. Then came Cecilia, the wife. She followed the silence. She called his name into the black mouth of the barn, her voice trembling like a dying candle. She walked past the spot where her husband lay cooling in the straw, blinded by the dark and the absolute precision of the killer. The pickaxe found her too. 7 strikes. This wasn't efficiency anymore. This was overkill. Maybe the killer hated her. Maybe she fought back with the strength of a woman who knew the devil was finally in her house. Her skull was shattered, but the killer remained calm. He was harvesting a family, one soul at a time. He was clearing the board. Before the grand finale, the blood began to pool, soaking into the earth that Andreas had worked so hard to dominate. Victoria was next, the daughter, the one with the beautiful voice and the ugly secrets. She brought the child with her, little Cecilia, 7 years old. Can you imagine the simulation of this moment? The child holding her mother's hand, walking into a room where her grandparents are already pieces of meat. Victoria saw the shadow. She saw the pickaxe, but there was nowhere to run. The killer struck with the rhythm of a clock. Tick, tock, dead. The child didn't die instantly. Forensic reports suggest she survived for hours, lying next to her mother's corpse, pulling out her own hair in clumps from the absolute terror. The killer didn't care. He was already finished with them. He was moving on to the house, to find the final 2 pulses. Look at the arrangement. The killer didn't just leave the bodies where they fell. He stacked them. He covered them with hay and a heavy wooden door, as if he was tucking them in for a long, eternal sleep. This is the mark of a methodical mind. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a cleanup operation. He cleared the barn to make room for his new life. He had 4 bodies in the straw, but he still had a maid in the bedroom and a baby in the crib. The night was still young, and the pickaxe was still thirsty. My perspective? The killer didn't feel like a monster that night. He felt like a homeowner, finally getting rid of the clutter. The barn was quiet now, but the house was about to scream. The slaughter was over, but the house was still breathing. Most killers have a getaway car or a dark forest to hide in, but this one, he had a new home. For the next 72 hours, Hinterkaifeck wasn't a crime scene. It was a functioning farm run by a ghost. The neighbors looked at the chimney and saw smoke rising into the cold Bavarian sky. They thought Andreas was keeping the fire going for his family. They were half right. The fire was burning. The house was warm, but the ones who paid for the coal were cooling in the straw. Imagine the cold logic. Why run into a winter storm when you have a warm bed, a full pantry, and a family that can no longer complain about the guest? This is predatory domesticity. The killer didn't just take their lives. He took their chores. He ate their bread. He drank their milk. Can you visualize the simulation of a man sitting at a wooden table, chewing slowly while 6 corpses lie within earshot? Forensic evidence showed the killer fed the cattle. He gave water to the horses. He kept the machine of the farm running with mechanical precision. Every morning for 3 days, he woke up in a house filled with the smell of wood smoke and decaying flesh. He wasn't bothered by the silence. He was the architect of it. He walked across the floors he had just stained with blood, probably wearing Andreas's slippers, living a stolen life in a stolen home. My perspective? The 3 days after the murder were more violent than the murders themselves. It was a slow, methodical violation of everything a home is supposed to be. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was replacing the victims. The most chilling pulse was in the bedroom. Little Joseph, 2 years old, murdered in his crib. The killer didn't just strike him. He left him there to be part of the furniture. While the neighbors knocked on the door over the weekend, getting no answer, the killer stayed inside, possibly watching them through the same attic cracks he used before the slaughter. He saw them leave. He felt the safety of their confusion. The dog, the family's loyal protector, was tied up in the barn, barking into the void until its throat was raw. The killer even fed the dog. A mercy? No, just maintenance. He wanted everything in his new kingdom to stay alive until he was ready to vanish. He was a king of corpses, ruling over a territory of ash and bone. The madness wasn't in the blood. It was in the normalcy of it all. By April 4th, the smell of death became stronger than the smell of wood smoke. The killer knew the clock had run out. He cleaned his blade. He packed nothing. He simply walked out the front door and disappeared into the fog, leaving the footprints in the snow for someone else to find. When the neighbors finally broke in, they found the table set for a meal. They found a warm stove. And then, they found the barn. The occupation of Hinterkaifeck ended with a scream that lasted for a century. But the man who lived there for 3 days took the truth with him into the Bavarian woods. He didn't just leave a crime scene. He left a void that science can never fill. We have the bodies. We have the time of death. But the man in the attic remains a ghost of our own creation. Let's look at the suspects. To understand the killer, we must first understand the rot in the victims. Hinterkaifeck wasn't just a farm. It was a social quarantine. The village of Kaifeck didn't pity the Grubers. They feared them, they loathed them, and they whispered about them in the back pews of the church. Andreas Gruber was a man of cold violence and darker hungers. He didn't just isolate his family from the world. He owned them. In 1915, the law finally looked inside. Andreas and his daughter, Victoria, were convicted of incest, a sin so heavy it stained the very soil they walked on. Andreas went to prison, but when he came back, the house didn't change. It just grew quieter. The neighbors knew the smell of sin was stronger than the smell of manure. They watched from a distance, waiting for the divine lightning to strike a house built on such a foul foundation. Let's talk about Joseph, 2 years old, murdered in his crib. But who was his father? The village had a name, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the ex-lover, the man who Victoria claimed was the father of her child to hide the truth of her father's bed. Lorenz paid child support, but he didn't pay it with love. He paid it with bitterness. He wanted to marry Victoria, but Andreas refused. Why? Because Andreas didn't want to lose his wife, even if that wife was his own flesh and blood. Think about the dynamic. A house filled with 2 men who hated each other, and a woman caught between a father who owned her and a lover who was shamed by her. Joseph wasn't a baby to them. He was a piece of living evidence, a biological mistake that reminded everyone of the rot in the rafters. In a simulation of madness, Joseph was the fuse that was bound to ignite. Now look at the aftermath. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was one of the first to discover the bodies. He didn't wait for the police. He entered the barn alone. He moved the corpses. He touched the evidence. He acted like a man who was cleaning his own house, not a neighbor stumbling upon a massacre. Was it grief? Or was it a final act of domestic maintenance? He claimed he was looking for his son, yet he didn't seem surprised by the blood. The police suspected him for years, but they could never bridge the gap between suspicion and handcuffs. He had the motive vengeance for a ruined life. He had the opportunity. He lived nearby and knew the farm's every secret. But more importantly, he had the hatred. In the Noir world, hatred is a better fuel than gasoline. He was a man scorned, and Hinterkaifeck was the monument to his humiliation. My perspective? This wasn't a robbery. This was an exorcism by fire and steel. Someone decided that the rot in Hinterkaifeck had gone on long enough. Someone decided that the Gruber bloodline needed to be severed at the root. The killer didn't just kill people. He killed a legacy of shame. He sat in that attic and watched the sin unfold below him until he couldn't stand the smell of it anymore. He became a self-appointed moral executioner, using a pickaxe to carve out the cancer from the village. The tragedy isn't that they died. The tragedy is that they lived like that for so long, while the world looked the other way. The simulation of the suspect list is vast, but the shadow in the attic always looks a lot like someone who knew exactly where the secrets were buried. The occupation is over. Now, let's look at the ghost who escaped. 1923. The farm was torn down. The neighbors couldn't stand the sight of it anymore. They wanted to erase the geometry of the massacre, thinking that if the walls were gone, the ghost would leave too. They were wrong. You can burn the wood, but you can't burn the memory of a pickaxe. When they demolished the barn, they found the final piece of evidence, a hidden star-shaped tool, and the killer's nesting spot in the hay. He had been there for weeks, a human tumor growing in the attic of their lives. The simulation shows a man who knew every creak of the floorboards, every weakness of the locks, and every sin of the inhabitants. He didn't just stumble upon the farm, he chose it as his stage. Now, let's look at the ghost who might have had a name. Carl Gabriel. Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, officially reported dead in the trenches of France in 1914. But in the fog of war, dead is often just a synonym for disappeared. What if he survived? What if he came home to find his wife pregnant with her own father's child? Imagine the rage. A soldier returning from the hell of the front lines, only to find a different kind of hell in his own bedroom. He didn't want a divorce. He wanted an obliteration. He knew the farm. He knew the routines. He lived in the attic like a ghost of the Great War, watching the incestuous rot unfold until he decided to end the bloodline himself. It's the perfect Noir ending. The dead man coming back to collect the souls of those who replaced him. No money was taken. No valuables missing. Just a debt paid in blood. Science failed this case. In a desperate move, the police cut off the heads of the victims and sent them to Munich. They didn't send them to doctors. They sent them to clairvoyants. Psychics screaming at bone, trying to hear the name of the killer in the silence of the skulls. It was a circus of the occult. And then, during World War II, the skulls were lost in the bombings. The final physical evidence of Hinterkaifeck vanished into the ash of history. 6 headless bodies are buried in a single grave in Weidhofen, waiting for a truth that will never arrive. The mystery didn't just remain unsolved. It was decapitated. My perspective? The killer didn't just escape. He won. He lived the life he wanted for 3 days, then walked into the fog and became a legend. He is the patron saint of the things that hide in your ceiling. This is the end of the simulation. Hinterkaifeck remains a warning, written in blood and frozen mud. Next time you hear a creak in your attic, next time you find a newspaper you didn't buy, don't assume it's the wind. Assume the parasite has already chosen its host. I am ex-crime noir. I deal in the truth that hides in the shadows. If you want to see the next simulation, subscribe and leave a pulse in the comments. Tell me, was it the husband, the lover, or the monster we create ourselves? Stay in the shadows. Good night.
Case closed.